Good afternoon. Welcome to Board of Education, Special Board of Education Business Committee meeting on budget. Would like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the lands of the Hokuminum speaking people, specifically Wamaton Village. The Board of Education is honored to be able to collaboratively walk beside the Quw'utsun, Malahats, Savasset, Halalt, Penelakats, Manus, and Laxan peoples who have cared for this land for thousands of years. May we walk gently on the ceded and the unceded territories of their lands as we work together to lift up all our hahas minam. We have apologies from Eduardo. Is Joe coming?
I haven't heard a word.
Okay. And Cindy?
Cindy is online, and she will be leaving us at 4:30.
Perfect. Okay. Adoption of the agenda. Motion to adopt the agenda. Trustee Schmidt, Trustee Croft, all in favor? Pass. Business and operations, annual budget. Mr. Sandquist.
Let's go.
Thank you, Chair. This evening we have a very significant budget presentation for the board as we walk through how we arrived where we are today, what's in the current budget, some potential options for consideration, and I will just get going. So I'm going to use the screen for those that don't have it in front of them. To first say this is the 2024-2025 annual budget, and we're here at the special BEBC meeting of April 11th. Moving right along. It's always good to begin to frame our budget discussions by reviewing our budget guiding principles. Those are used to help guide our work as we work into the budget. So new this year was intentionally targets funds towards resources aimed at increasing Indigenous student graduation rates. We also have our budget guiding principles that all the decisions must align with the priorities of Beyond Education strategic plan. And we will begin to bring the recommendations in alignment with those strategic priorities as we move through the next month. You have seen the feedback aligned to the strategic priorities that you received from all of the partner groups and public meetings, and we'll continue to do so. The budget is developed as a mechanism to aid in reconciliation. I've just said the new one. Developed on the principles of equity, must be developed in a transparent process and must include public and partner input through communication, consultation, and report back. So we've done consultation and we've done some communication, but at the end of this, it's important that we report out the decisions that are made in the final budget. Accounts for uncertainties of inflationary pressures. I believe we're starting to get a little more certain as that begins to stabilize. Of course, we have to comply with the School Act, collective agreements. Think about this on a multi-year implications. I'm going to show you a multi-year financial plan. Balances short and long-term priorities, and then we always have to think about our contingency balance. What do we have in the bank if something goes sideways? There are 4 priorities of the strategic plan. I know you all know them: learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, culture, care, and future-focused systems. So we'll keep those at the forefront as we work through the budget. We haven't brought this out in our budget process before, but the board does have an individual.
May I ask a question regarding our priorities? I know that this is the 2024-2025 budget, and I know that future focus systems is one of the current priorities, but are we also looking at the other 2 priorities that are slightly different than these last 2 bullets? So we're looking at 6 maybe instead of 4?
Well, they haven't been adopted by the board yet.
No, but we're looking at them.
Yes, and I think you could always be thinking about them. They're not that different than these 2 here. They're more of a rewrite of them.
Okay.
But I believe future focused systems will potentially have more of an environmental lens on it than it does now, and culture care more around a self-care.
Okay, so we are looking at the future. Okay.
We haven't really talked about Administrative Procedure 412 before, but the board does have an administrative procedure around periods of diminishing financial resources. And it's really that the board are guided by maintaining high level programming across the system and will do their greatest efforts to preserve programs, and that they will also do their greatest efforts to ensure job security. So this is something to bring up because I think we're starting to hit into that periods of diminishing financial resources. Our money's getting greater, but our costs are exceeding the money, and to me that is a period of diminishing financial resources. So you do have an administrative procedure on that. I thought that would be good to highlight that. I usually start you off with a theme. The last 2 years were inflation. I showed you a chart of an area, and now it's really just around that we're continuing to see cost pressures exceed funding. It is creating quite a pinch on our budget, and we'll show you how that those impacts. What have you been up to so far in the 2024-2025? And this is great. Why we started so early. The board have accomplished quite a bit to this point. You have established your budget guiding principles, and you have the new one. A survey has gone out on the budget. It wasn't as well replied to this year as maybe some of the other years, but there's always diverse feedback, and that has been reported out. You've had liaison meetings with rights holders. There's now been 3. And there will continue to be more that are scheduled, and you'll get the results of those. And then there was DSAC, the Indigenous Student Leadership Group, the teachers, the steelworkers, CUPE, the principal, vice principals, and DPAC, and that feedback has come to the board. We held a public feedback meeting. Nobody came. However, we did try, and hopefully we'll get people back to the budget table to provide their feedback in person in the future. And then you received information from staff at the last BEBC and the board meeting. And at the last BEBC, we reviewed the ministry funding announcement. We showed you how it went up by about $2 million. We showed you the overall changes in the operating grant rates, the changes in our operating revenues, and the changes in our operating expenditures, especially how the benefits had increased and some of the other inflationary pressures that had exceeded our revenue increase. We made some assumptions around interest rates and around benefit rates that we still didn't really fully know. And we updated the surplus reconciliation. I brought you a projection to the end of the year and showed you where we thought we would be. And I'll bring that up again. At this meeting, we're going to review some options. There'll be an opportunity to provide feedback. Of course, we're open to answering any questions as we go along. And then we're going to review the 2 primary special purpose funds. That is the Costume Enhancement Fund and Community Link. These are the 2 that you really have the most discretion over components of. And I brought this up last year, and I always think it's important to note that I always feel like we're budgeting year-round. The board are budgeting year-round, and you're not just getting feedback at the moment that you have a liaison meeting for an hour with an employee group. You go to advisory, and that is made up of employees and students and parents and unions. And you have collective bargaining. When we're in that process, you're hearing about what are the things that are important to the unions as they bring those forward as proposals. You may have delegations. They can come at open and close where you're informed. And you rotate attendance at DSAC and DPAC. So I feel like you're always collecting information on the district that helps you to guide your budget conversations. And I just felt that was important to bring up here publicly. You'll have conversations with other trustees and with the public, just as you're out in the grocery line. And then you're brought information through the board, education, and business committee from school and district teams. And we're always bringing you regular projection updates so you can actually see how spending is aligning with the budget that you set. So you're getting a lot of points of input throughout the entire year. And I think staff are as well. You tell us your value statements and your strategic priorities. We're here when you make decisions at the board table, and even now behind me we have staff that are here and they're listening to what you say. And then we have board planning where we bring you information and then you have a candid exchange with us on the questions that you have. So I think we're always also collecting information. The budget cycle is really 12 months. It's dynamic. You'll adopt it at a point in time. It will change the very next day. So now we're getting into the real information on this budget. The shared recovery mandate. So the collective agreements were bargained, we're in the final year, year 3, and year 3 had a clause that all unionized staff would receive 2%, and if inflation exceeded 3, it could go up to 3. So inflation was at 3.4%, so we know now that we're budgeting for 3%, and that's what we used in our initial position. We're still having to estimate the funding that we're going to receive. What is the difference between the 2% that's part of our grant and the 3% that we're going to be receiving, and the component that's going to fund exempt staff increases? We will not have that by the end of April, likely. I understand from a conversation I had today that we should expect that sometime in early May. So we're going with my estimate of how much money that is, and I don't think it's going to be off by much. It wasn't last year, because we actually have last year's as a basis to base it on when that was 1.25%. Now, what does it look like when it's 1%? Well, technically, it's probably, do the math, 4/5 of what we got last year. So that's important. So we're using $949,000 is what we think is going to be additional funding that's going to come into the board for those cost of living allowances. So I wanted just to note that. Also, I want to talk about the Student and Family Affordability Fund. And although this funding is arriving in 23-24, it is permitted to be carried over to 24 and 25. And I expect that we'll see this funding come through the board and through the advisory committee very, very shortly as we look at how best to distribute it. So we're looking at how it was spent in the last time we received it. But the reason I brought it up here is because it won't all be expended this year. It will become part of the 24-25 budget. It will be carried over, and we'll need to make an allocation. Also wanted to highlight that it's one time, it's $347,000. So it will likely be distributed on 1/3 this year, because we have a little bit of this year left, and 2/3 next year to get it all expended on an even way. So I wanted just to bring that up. New is funding for Indigenous Education Councils. Here's a whole bunch of stuff related to Bill 40. That's here for your information. Basically, it just talks about how Indigenous Education Councils have new powers in relation to advising boards on information related to the territories for which they reside, on educational matters and financial matters. It came with funding. So in our grant, there is $118,726 to support the work of those councils. And these funds are targeted. And we built these funds into part of the 131 Indigenous Education budget, and one is education and 31 is Indigenous education. And they're intended to offset expenses related to the establishment of those councils, the maintenance of them, implementation and negotiation of local collective agreements. So this can do things like pay an honorarium for the members that attend, or pay travel expenses for the members that attend, or book a venue for the members that attend. And I think there's still a lot of information that's coming out on this, but we have budgeted for it to the exact amount of $118,726. So it's an in and it's an out. But it's new. And here we start. When we were last here, we showed you that expenditures exceeded revenues by $3,574,719. And you have a big sheet of paper on your desk. And on the far left-hand side, you should see that number right down at the bottom. Starting place. This is before we bring in any surplus to assist with balancing this year's budget. This includes our estimate for the COLA and exempt staff. We have made a guess that teachers and principals, their health benefits, which are the extended health and dental, will increase by 7.44%. That is the amount that CUPE's increased. So it is a best estimate at this point. For some reason, we get CUPE's and we get the steelworkers early, and we have to wait almost to the end of our budget process before we receive those rates for our teachers and principals and vice principals and exempt. We're assuming that our WorkSafe BC demerits in 2025 will be equal to those in 2024. But that is actually going down a little bit from when we first built our budget. There are some potential savings in WorkSafe now that we have to do a calculation on. As claims get adjusted, as we work with School District 23 who manage our claims, every time one gets adjusted in the favor of the board, the rate goes down because the premium, the amount of money that they're having to pay out has gone down. And so I think our rate is dropping modestly, and not talking about a lot of money, but it is beginning to drop modestly. And we need to think about the Bank of Canada. A big portion of our revenues this year were interest, which is new. For the last few years, interest rates have been increasing. But prior to that, they were literally almost nothing, and we were getting 1% or 0.5% on our funding. So we know that Bank of Canada held the key rate yesterday, but it's going to start to drop. And how quickly that's going to drop, we've done some work around estimating, and you'll see here in a package. And we're also assuming that global inflation won't affect our international student program enrollment. Certainly, we're still modifying markets, and it seems on track for next year. Okay. Oops. It's not a PowerPoint. I'm going to move it normally. So some of the things we already had in that opening position, we had already removed one FTE exempt staff. And that was the Director of Communications, who left us for SFU. And thanks to Acting Assistant Superintendent Rowan, he's picked up the duties in his new role of Assistant Superintendent of Communications and Community Relations. So we have one FTE already out, so you've already made an exempt staff reduction. We did not increase teacher FTE for an increase of 71 FTE of students. Normally, there would be a 1 to 20-ish ratio that may be applied there to add teaching time. Our initial calculations show that the budget is sufficient in operating to do what we're required to do and what we did this year. So from an openings point of view, that is just how the numbers fall sometimes. The difference between 10 divisions and 11 divisions can be 1, 2 students, and it's working. So we didn't have to add those in. And we also have a bubble of students moving into the higher grades. And I think you saw that our enrollment was getting larger in the upper grades and not in the lower grades. Well, class sizes are much smaller in the primary grades. So as we move those students into the bigger grades, class sizes are bigger. You need fewer teachers to teach those students. I don't know if that makes sense. So just sort of mathematically, you can put 24 students in a class in grade 7 and 15 in kindergarten, so as those other numbers get bigger, less teachers.
So that agreement you have within the collective bargaining agreement where a teacher earns more based on larger class sizes, does that still apply in?
Oh, they don't have that.
They
have remedy if they go over a limit, and that's completely separate. That's classroom enhancement fund.
Okay.
So we staff based on if the collective agreement had never been restored, and we go back to 2002 language that we held in place until 2015, that's what we have to pay for out of the operating funds. The ministry gives us a separate bucket for the difference.
Okay.
And that is what we're working on right now. Margaret was working on that today.
Okay.
What that difference is. And that is fully funded. Okay. But this part is what is the board responsible for paying for, and we have not added teachers. I just wanted to make that really clear. Because that is essentially almost a reduction before we even started. So here is what we have in the budget so far. I know this is very, very high level, but you can see the FTE of all the different types of positions that make up our salaries. So 894 FTE are currently employed, and this doesn't include substitutes or casuals or TTOCs or all the different terminology. And so, there we have $74 million worth of salaries laid out as you see there. Now, casuals represent 5.5 million. That's not all sick leave. Some of that is vacation coverage if you're looking at CUPE and the USW. Some of that is in service because they're still substitutes when we call in replacements to do training with staff. Some of that might be department heads because a department head gets release time and a substitute comes in and provides that coverage for them when they do that work. Some of that might be extracurricular because there's extracurricular funds that go to schools to support their outside of school time or during school time activities when we have to have a TTOC. So that is the staffing component. The benefits are on the rise. So the benefit rates are what we were talking about being one of our biggest pressures this year. If I'll be able to show you how later on in this presentation how that's gone from about 23% to 25%, and that doesn't necessarily sound like a big increase, but it really is when you're talking about the dollar value that it's based on of $75 million. So we have our stat, our pension, and our health benefits listed there, so $20,771,000. And then services. Services is everything from accounting fees to our auditors, to our legal fees, to contracts. You may also find, the big piece you're going to find in there is dual credit tuition. So we have revenue coming in, and that is where the payments go out to support the VAU and COMOSIN programs that our students are participating in. Student transportation is predominantly a contract with Cowichan Tribes who provide on-reserve busing. That would be the biggest piece there, a little bit of odds and ends on top of that. Prody and travel, some of that is collective agreement driven, so we have to pay professional development funds out to the teachers union, and we also have funds in there for CUPE and the USW that are in their contract. And then there's the basic travel. We have a lot of staff that are itinerant and they have mileage paid, or it's out of district travel for individuals, and that's what makes up that line item. Rentals and leases, we're going to do a little bit deeper dive. I think that's going to be one of our reductions that you don't have on your list right now. As Cowichan Secondary opens, it's likely we won't need to use the space at the community center that they're currently using. So we'll be, if you're just finalizing that shortly. Dues and fees, you will find that probably most of that is your BC STA, it would be about half of that. The membership, which provides legal services and trustee development. Insurance, vehicle fleet, and just our overall insurance that protects our buildings and our staff. Supplies, that is a big bucket of custodial and fuel for buses and bus repairs and maintenance supplies and school supplies and learning resources, etc. Utilities would be our hydro and water and gas and oil and the little chips they burn out at Lake Cowichan School. And then equipment replacement. This budget is newer in the last few years. The board's been setting aside money for a maintenance replacement program. You have 21st century furniture in there, and you also have money for special ed, inclusive ed equipment replacement. So those have been some new additions, and I'll show you all the things you've done over the last number of years here shortly. And then we have operating capital to pay for some software that we're currently working on, which is also a potential reduction. That software could be funded from local capital because it is a capital item. So that's something we could consider to move into our local capital funding. That's now sitting at about $1.4 million. Soon to be increased with the sale of property. So here are some things the board have done in recent years. I hope that's big enough. Again, this is a font. A number of years ago, literacy and numeracy programs were enhanced. This brought in a district principal and I believe a coordinator that worked in these programs that wasn't there previously. That was an area the board wanted to focus on. Still in the budget. 21st century learning furniture. That was, you listened to kids who said they wanted to have more innovative classroom spaces, and this allows some schools, it doesn't do a massive refresh, but it allows 4 or 5 schools to submit and have something really, really nice for students to learn with. You put in money for additional mental health supports of $70,000, strategic plan implementation funding. After COVID, everybody decided that the hand washing stations were still good practice for kids. It wasn't a bad idea that everybody washed their hands and that we had hand sanitizer in the entrances, and that cost money, and we've left that in. Then there was additional assessments and inclusive education equipment.
We have a question, Trustee.
The custodian supplies line, is that also the money that we earmarked for 3 years last year?
No, it isn't.
Okay, it's different. Okay.
Yeah, that would be separate money. And then you had inclusive education equipment. So that was, there were years that they didn't have they were operating off an old grant that they were almost hoarding to the last penny that the province had provided. And so this allows for all that equipment that works with the students with exceptional needs, that they, the chairs and the various tables, etc., that they need to purchase and update. We have a question?
Over here.
Trustee Croft, sorry.
I'm so easily ignored. So just for the one or two people who are listening at home, these are amounts these aren't the full budgets of our literacy numeracy programs. This is some other monies that we've directed towards it. So in fact, these programs have more robust budgets than this particular one. Thank you.
Yes, these are the enhancements, and I bring them up, not that none of them are not wanted. They are just things you have put in that you can potentially also undo. Updated website, one of my recommendations will be around funding related to that one. That's nearing its conclusion. I believe this is the question of...
Trustee Shank.
I gotta keep your hat on a swivel, Trustee Doman, on this one. I want to talk about $30,000 a year for the updated website. Can you tell me exactly how many years we've been putting $30,000 aside for the updated website?
It was a $60,000 project, and we carried over funding that wasn't spent last year because it got off to a slow start. Mm-hmm. And so we have 2 years at $30,000.
And then that's it. We won't see this again next year?
One of my recommendations is that number. This next one refers, I believe, to Trustee Smith's question around around custodial equipment replacement, the multi-year plan that was added to the budget. You heard from kids and you did district-wide composting. You set aside $12,000. Maintenance, this is last year, maintenance and transportation equipment replacement. That's the 3-year plan at $50,000. Then we had we had a one item that was very general for additional inclusive education supports, which I believe is predominantly been spent on assessments. There was $20,000 for climate action. So as the climate action group works through some initiatives, that still exists in our budget. And then the parent communication app. During the power outages and other storms, it became very important that we needed to have better way to communicate with parents. That remains in the budget. That's a fair total of items. That's about $1 million that's been added in over the last few years of sort of new things to the budget. I just wanted to highlight them all. It's all really good.
Trustee Croft.
Just regarding the communication app, that thing has been purchased, right? Yeah. So is there an ongoing maintenance cost that goes with that shows up somewhere?
This is
it's the same. Yes. Okay, all right, pardon me. Okay. That's what it'll cost us to keep it.
And I believe it's being demoed out at Discovery right now.
Okay, thank you.
So we're starting in a shortfall, and that is when our expenditures exceed our budgeted revenues. But we have strategies that we can use to try to balance the budget, and they're limited. We can utilize prior year surplus. We can find ways to reduce expenditures, and we can find ways to increase revenues. And we're always wanting to add to the budget. There's always asks, but in a time of diminishing resources, especially a shortfall, it becomes really difficult to do new things without taking something else away. And so that'll be part of the balancing act that will happen through this budget as we put together the pieces of this puzzle. So as we start out here, we're looking at just over 90% of the wages and benefits. I think we actually ended last year a little under 90. We were in the 89% when we had our amended budget. So that's going up, and that's really driven by about that 1% increase in our overall benefit cost versus wages. So that's we're getting more and more of wages and benefits in our budget as we start out here. And you can see the various columns there, bulk of it being wages, and then services and supplies being almost the rest of it. Utilities and insurance are really non-negotiables. They are what they are. I think we're already doing really good work around energy management and energy controls in our schools, and I don't think anybody would suggest they were any colder in the winter. So here we go. If I had this up on a PowerPoint, this would all fly through really cool when it would start and be really dramatic where you just would see one line at a time, but it's all here. I'm not using the PowerPoint. So we're starting out with 3.574 million, and I'm going to direct you to your packages on your desktop. These packages have notes, and I'll talk about each note is here for you to review at your own desire. Now the notes are here to give you some more information that I may not speak about in the level of detail that I need you to know what these are, just because there could be considerations with positions, and we wouldn't normally not do that in an open way that would lead somebody to be concerned if it's an option that doesn't get accepted. So right away, we are looking at appropriation of this year's surplus. And I'm going to get into where we're actually at shortly with that. But if the board were to bring in $2 million, you would be left with 2% of your surplus and contingency. You'd be right square in the middle of your 1 to 3% surplus contingency policy with $2 million. But I've showed you what it looks like with 2.2, you'd be at 1.8. And if you had 2.4, you'd be at 1.62%. And that's on your note. That's note 1. So that's note 1. Transfer of operating expenses to CLINK, Community Link. That's note 2. As we did an analysis on the Community Link Fund, we see that we likely have items in operating that belong in CLINK, because the CLINK is surplusing beyond what we had budgeted. And that means we need to transfer some expenditures into the Community Link. And when we do that, we will generate additional surplus. So by moving operating expenses, eligible operating expenses, to Community Link dollars that need to be spent, we can generate another $250,000 worth of surplus. That's what that is, surplus generation. It doesn't, and that still leaves 2%, because that's not included in the $2 million calculation. Note 3, the board had set aside $250,000 for a local capital transfer, from operating to local capital for the renovation of this building. When you did that, you had no local capital left. It had all been allocated to couch and secondary and to the Francis Kelsey portables that we had to buy to deal with the enrollment pressures there. But through the work with the ministry on reallocating the distribution of the board's contribution to couch and secondary to get more money out of ministry restricted capital and less out of local capital, we restored about $800,000. Then we got the release of the contingency reserve from the Ministry of Education and Child Care for the new co-eds and secondary, and we were able to pay for those change orders that the board had funded for $480,000. So you restored your local capital by $1.3 million, in a matter of about a month, just through those two processes. So we don't need to move this $250,000 because we're not doing the renovation project. And when we don't do that, we add to our surplus this year by $250,000. So that one I think is pretty easy because the project didn't actually happen. Okay, that's note 3. That's note 4. So that was note 4, 3.
And ours is
Oh, I gotta go back to note 2. Note 2 is interest revenue.
Yeah.
I'm out of order.
Yeah.
My apologies. We're going to generate about $1.2 million in interest revenue this year, but we know that that's not going to last. And Claudia's done a bunch of work around an analysis, and I did some work around an analysis, and we came pretty close to each other's number as we both looked at this. And when we did our analysis, we assumed that the interest rates would drop kind of all at once, pretty much. Like if we drop the percent, it drops on June 1st. That's not going to happen. It's going to be weighted over the balance of the year. So even if it drops more than 1.25%, which I think was the stress test that we used, we still think we can add interest revenue safely into this budget for one more year. And then you'll see as they do the multi-year planning, it's going to have to start coming back down again. So we think we can do this because we don't believe interest rates will decline at an extremely rapid pace. And if they do, we'll be halfway through the school year before that happens. So that's one of our recommendations is around interest revenue. Then I'm moving on to, those are our revenue generations. So if we do all that, we're only $1 million short. Only. Enrollment-based staffing adjustment. You have more details on what that really means in your package, but we do have a reduction in designations in our projection, and they're actually, the number that we're using in our projection for our funding is actually pretty close to what's coming in at this very moment. That's an easy one to toggle. If more designations come in, the board gets more funding and you can put services back. But a 50 student drop in designations has a correlating staffing reduction typically. And that's what that is. Moving on to clerical reallocation, that is note 6 and note 7 combined. And that is just really around providing supports to schools. And that finds a net savings of $44,000, and you can look at those two notes and put them together and see exactly what we're talking about there. Note 8 becomes the automated call-out. This was one of our reductions for this year that didn't happen because our system didn't roll out as quickly as we thought. It is actually happening already before the end of this year that we will be moving from 2 dispatchers to 1 dispatcher. At least we believe it's before the end of this year, I think. Is that correct? So that is a position that's in the budget that the system will be automated and will be down to one call-out clerk next year, which was one of your budget reductions this year. It didn't happen. We had to put it back in, and now it can come back out.
She's tracking.
So that enrollment-based staffing adjustment, it looks like a huge amount, but is that based on the salary dollars alone? Which really is
All salary.
That's not a lot of staff, really.
It's all salary.
Yeah. And how quick does that turn over? How fast does that usually turn over? It's not immediate, is it?
No, it is the first number. We just the number of positions that we have available. It aligns to the number of designations, and again, it toggles.
Yeah.
This year it went way up, and board puts them in, and now those student numbers have dropped.
Now, last year we put extra money in the budget so that we could have some testing done over the summer, and that's continuing this year, right? So realistically, we'll probably be able to. I mean, did we get, was it 12 EAs that we recovered last year from the testing?
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully the same outcome.
Yeah, it could be very possible. Okay.
If I could clarify, piecing together some other conversations we've had at the table, that 50, a lot of those are graduating kids, right? And kids who are special needs in high school typically receive slightly fewer resources than kids require in the primary grades. Am I right in that?
Sorry, is that one you want to answer, or we want to give it to Darlene?
Are we talking apples and apples here, or are we talking apples and oranges? Because that's a pretty specific population that's moving on.
I think it would be appropriate for Darlene to answer.
Okay.
Through the chair. This reduction is specifically in our level 1, level 2 students, and those are students with higher needs, whether they're at elementary or secondary. Okay. So it's not quite, you're definitely right in some categories that difference does impact, but for these particular levels, I wouldn't see it having as much impact.
Okay, I think we're on note 9, which is one of our coordinators, and this is related to a combination of inclusive education and learning that has resulted in more efficiencies. So this is one of the recommendations here. Contracts. This one is. I'm going to move over because now these are all of the reductions and now they're all over the place. That's note 14. So contracts is predominantly the website, which should be completed. But we also know that we have some funding set aside in the budget that was for long-range facilities planning. That project concluded. And for community outreach, so we're still kind of carrying a Mike McKay budget from a number of years ago that we believe we can also make some adjustments to. So we have $30,000 within our contract budget that we can remove without any implication. Additional inclusive ed supports. This may or may not be supported.
May I ask what note that is, please, because we're jumping all over the place now.
Yes, you may. Thank you. Maybe I need to organize this a little bit more aligned. This one is note 12. Thank you. So over the last couple of years, the board has increased inclusive education supports for both mental health and assessments by $210,000. We're still continuing to receive funding from the Ministry of Education for the mental health component. So we're believing that we could take this 50 out without impacting assessments. There's a question.
Oh, trustee Schmidt.
If the 50 was taken out, where is it being taken out of? Mental health supports?
Yes. You may not approve this one. Okay.
Mandy?
Oh, trustee Croft.
Thank you. My question is, sure, it looks great, we can take 50,000 out, but what's the reduction in service or resources that goes with that? Because we're paying for it now, we must be doing something with it. What won't we be doing if we remove it?
I don't believe it'll be fully spent this year.
Okay. Do you know how much will be left over? Sorry, follow it.
I'm going to refer to Assistant Superintendent Rowan, who's leading the mental health work.
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I do believe we should end up still with $30,000 to $40,000 remaining.
Okay.
For more detail, the ministry grant also gives us $52,000, and your grant, well, it's great. We did have quite a bit of money to try to do our initiatives.
Okay.
Trustee Thorne.
Seeing this, I'm pretty much terrified of next year's budget. We talked a while ago, Jason, about a 3-year budget plan, and we got to start focusing on the big picture. What's going to happen in 2025 versus what's going on now with 2024. And it has me concerned because I remember when we came on the first time, we were already in deficit before we took our oath. And we worked hard to get out of that. We had worked hard to get out of funding protection. And when I look at this and then I see everybody, okay, we'll take it out of this, and I'm starting to think to myself, we're not looking at that picture. We're looking at the narrow end. And that has me concerned that we may put ourselves in a very jeopardizing spot with inflation. And I see all of these teachers' wages and everything else. It has me concerned that we could run into a brick wall.
There'll be some information in a multi-year at the end of the budget presentation that should hopefully address Trustee Thorne's questions. So if those reductions were all accepted, there would be $137,000 to the good. But there's some extra add-ons, and we'll start with note 10. And this is gaining some media attention, and we saw today in the BCSDA media mail out that a number of school districts are beginning to not be able to afford their Strong Start programs and beginning to consolidate and reduce even further. We hit that tipping point this year where we went from 8 programs to 6 programs just due to the funding not keeping up with inflation and the costs. And that will use up all the surplus that we have in Strong Start. Now, a fair bit of that was generated during COVID and helped us carry on because those programs weren't able to be offered in the way that they normally would be for a particular period of time. So with 6 Strong Starts and approximately $8,000 shortfall per Strong Start, we would need to supplement by $48,000.
And then just a reminder to the board that Vancouver Island School Trustees Association is taking a motion to the AGM regarding fully funding Strong Starts, because it seems that throughout the island, but on the Lower Mainland, I noticed that there was one there that's starting to cancel Strong Starts, and so I know that BCST will probably support this, so hopefully we can continue to advocate for Strong Start.
Trustee Croft.
More of a comment, and that is that speaking to Trustee Thorne's point about the long term, is if we keep cutting, preschool and early education stuff, it just gets way more expensive down the road. And so, yeah, I'm not sure I see the wisdom in that. Yeah.
My next item can be found under note 11. And for the last 2 years, which ended this year, the board has received $175,000 a year, which was really our startup money for before and after school care and child care supports, as that became part of the Ministry of, as child care became part of the Ministry of Education. This year, that funds both a manager of early learning and child care and an itinerant childcare position that's really critical to providing the coverage in those facilities when individuals are away. So this ensures that if somebody is ill, there's somebody who can go in and make sure that childcare opens for those families and cover that position. So we know that we have 1 more year that will support that manager out of the special purpose fund, but it will not support both positions. Because we have a manager and not a principal, like many districts do, we were able to get 2 positions for the price of 1, but now the money's running out. So this is to keep that position intact, and that now has to be funded out of the operating budget.
Mr. Cyclist, when are you expecting to find out if we are or are not getting the funding? Because this is something that maybe the board should act upon as far as writing a letter to the Minister of Mental Health, Minister of Education and Childcare to make sure that continues to be supported, considering we have childcare attached to the ministry now.
Yeah, I think we knew it was a 2-year when it first came out, but I haven't heard a thing about it continuing. I'm going to ask Darlene if she potentially has heard anything herself.
Through the chair. We did have a Zoom call recently with a few reps from the ministry that alluded to their belief that it may continue, but of course that came with no promises or assurances.
Okay, thank you.
Yet to be announced.
Okay.
So we're taking a proactive step and putting it in here. Note 13, another addition. As our staff age, there are many accommodations that are required for those workers that are exceeding the funding that we currently have in our budget. These might be for voice transmission, lighting conditions, blinds, for instance. And we realize that we need to have something to draw on to fund those. This is part of, a lot of these are either WorkSafe claims that are coming back into the workplace or just keeping people in comfortable work environments. Some of that is also ergonomics, so that's a request for an addition. The next item I have here can be found under note 15. I relied heavily on the district education leadership team to put this note together, so I thank them for what this is. When I was putting together the budget options, I just put in a dollar amount of $100,000 for Indigenous learner outcomes. It was one of the board's new budget guiding principles, and we knew that this is an area where work needs to be enhanced beyond what it currently is. And so the note here talks about how to intentionally target some funding towards Indigenous learner outcomes and the various programs and areas where they would like to use that are listed in your note. I'll leave that one there. The next one you can find under note 16, getting back in order. And this is the move to the new Coetzin Secondary. So there will be costs associated with that move. Some of that will address the uniforms that I know the students will need as they move from one school to a new school with a new name. I know that was important and it's been at the board table for some time.
I do want to say something about the uniforms. When the board decided to change the name of the school. Their uniforms were no longer any good, and that was a decision of the board. So I'm very happy that that note is in here, because the PAC could not have raised the funds to be able to change every uniform for the school. So I'm really glad to see that that's here, and that those, because of a decision we made, we're covering that cost. So that makes me really happy. Thank you.
I believe, you know, a good portion of this will also be some of the incidentals related to the move, as we'll buy boxes and other assorted items to get from point A to point B. And the final one is just a budget which is note 17, which is falling a little bit short, and that's on dual credit tuition, but it always comes with revenues. So we had bumped our revenues next year in relation to dual credit in our enrollment projection, and we need to match that as the program's starting to grow again. It's a very small amount, but I believe it's necessary to balance on that budget next year. And that's what that is. So if all of those things were options, although I believe one of them will require more board debate, and that would be the $50,000 for additional inclusive ed supports. But if all that was to be considered and accepted, we'd still be short by about $200,000. There are a few areas still to look. As I mentioned, we have some rentals that, as the school moves from one location to another, that we can consider. And we also know that after some really good work that Carrie did, who's here with us today, what we really realized is we're trying to figure out why are we budgeting more for pension every single year than we're actually paying out? And when you see my projections, there's often $300,000 that we're surplusing in pension year over year, or $400,000. And when you hit a certain age, you stop paying in. And our workforce is aging to the point where we have individuals now that aren't paying any pension premiums. And neither are the board on their behalf. And our budget program doesn't differentiate between those individuals.
I thought you were alluding to our age.
I had never considered that. I've been stumped by the answer, but it does relate a lot to the aging of a lot of our employees are aging out of actually contributing, and we don't consider that. We budget the benefit for every single employee. So there's some funds there that I know we'll be also able to bring back in the future for potential options as we work a little bit more in depth into this problem. So this is what we have so far, and we'll you've asked some good questions, and I'll continue on because there's much more here. Yes.
If I may sneak one in. So on note 1, you have different levels of reaching into our right. So if we're out at this point, you say we could be out 200,000. We're going to go look at it further, but does that relate back to whether we're taking 2,200,000?
If you wanted to solve it simply with surplus and be done,
yeah,
you would be using the $2.2 million number there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Because you're generating, in fact, through these options, if you accept that we move money in from operating into Community Link and use those funds, if you accept that we don't make the local capital transfer, you're generating another $500,000 through those two that are over and above the $2 million here. So it doesn't affect the bottom line.
Okay.
Trustee Thorne.
This may not be the place for it, but I have to pose this question. We have a nonprofit number, right?
Correct.
She already have.
And is there any way we could use that to access other funding agencies to help cover some of the things that we need or we know we're going to need as a contingency?
Well, we are a charitable organization, and we do receive charitable donations. We have a portal where people can donate to the school district's operation. Most of the charity that the board receives goes straight to student scholarships. That is because it comes with the conditions that what people wish to give so that kids can move on to post-secondary or other career training. But we don't have we're not a foundation, or we've investigated that in the past. It's very complex structure and often costs more than you have to really be able to generate the funding.
And that's why I asked is because I started thinking of Indigenous Education Foundation. With all of the money that they have for education, you know, I'd like to see I'm going to be asking that question when I see for next week. Why can't they meet with our dual credit people and look at something that they can help bail us out? I think a little bit different from some guys because I come from the streets, so I look for every option I can find. And when they have trades instructors, 3 that they cover the cost for. It doesn't replace anybody. They have all this money for different trades training, and that's dual credit. I started thinking, why aren't we doing that? It's just a thought, guys. If I confuse you, good.
Trustee Strachan.
The ability to have the board, us, not the staff that do all the work behind the scenes, our costs as a group, does it fall under business admin or school district governance or?
440, school
Yeah.
district governance, which also includes, we have the district elder in that category as well, as a lot of the work that she does represents the board, and we used to have our director of communications in that category as well.
So that 420, does that cover travel or is it
Yes.
just salary or is it everything?
It's everything. It's the BCSTA, it's travel, it's Pro-D, it's the elder, it's your stipends, predominantly what you will find in there. And there's also a supply allocation because you often hold meetings, and there's supplies related to that. And there's advertising because you're often calling those meetings. So it's made up of significant amount of line items.
So not a lot to pick away there. There's not a lot of meat on the bone, so to speak, although you've got the 30,000 on the contract.
Yeah.
Covered under
That's where that was too. That was coming out of there. Okay, we're going to move into the surplus reconciliation. You saw this at the last meeting. When we finished off the last year, June 30th, there was $6.7 million in the bank. You had already accessed 2.3 that grew to 2.4 of that. And then the other is just the rollover item. So that 6.7 really isn't 6.7 because you'd already had committed 1.2 of it, which is, Indigenous education targets and other things that are required to roll over. So we finished this year off with, we believe when we finished this year off that there was no surplus generated with $3.1 million. I brought you a projection on March 15th of $1,091,000. I've tested that again at March 31st and it's still holding, very similar to that in number. If we do the option note number 3 and note number 4, you generate another $500,000, those 250s that you see there, which would say that at the end of this year you'd have 4.7. So I know this is going to get confusing because I've been talking about bringing in 2, but I've made it 2.5 because we've created additional surplus to bring into the budget. So if you use 2.5 from notes 1, 3, and 4, you're still remaining with that 2.2 million that you see as part of note 1, 1.98% remaining. Okay, so I just want to give you an idea of where the surplus was at. Looking at that over time, we'll go back to 2016, 2017, the surplus was much smaller, and you can see that it remained smaller, 18, 19, 19, 20, and then 2021 is when we managed really well through COVID, and we came actually out of COVID with a substantial surplus that we've been using over the last few years. We drew it down in 21, 22, it bounced back in 22, 23, and we'd be drawing it down again in 23, 24. It gives you an idea of how it sort of fluctuates over time.
Trustee Croft.
Okay, so we're looking at that surplus history. We're looking at it in dollar amounts. We're not necessarily looking at it in terms of percentage of our budget.
Dollars, yes.
So that might show a slightly different relationship, right?
It probably would, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's always risk. I always like to talk about risk when we're budgeting and developing our estimates. We're always trying to pay attention and do the best estimates that we can. We always have the prior year's experience to go on. We can know rates and we can predict trends, but I think I use this example every time. When we're establishing a budget for hydro, we can make an estimate based on how much we know they're going to charge us per unit, but we never know how cold the winter's going to be. So we're always trying to have estimates that are fair and reasonable. If we become overly conservative, then we remove too much from the system, and that creates education risk because we're actually taking services away that could have gone to the learners. So it's a fine balance between those two things. What we think it's going to cost. We could always have a budget that we know would always. We're going to have a raised hand here too. It's got to figure who that is. It's probably Cindy. It's Cindy. And then. Oh, I got a question. I was going to
Okay, go ahead.
It's Cindy. Cindy has a question.
Oh, go ahead, Cindy.
I think it's Cindy. Is she still here? I can't see.
She's saying she had to leave at 4:30.
No, it's not, it's an attendee.
Oh, it's an attendee. Okay. So we don't have question period, so I'll just remove that. Thank you. Yeah, so we're always trying to balance our financial risks against our estimates. And moving along, options to consider balancing with risk factors. We could go further into our surplus, but then that would create some risks as we move forward into the prior years. We want to make sure that surpluses are not overly generous, but we need to stay within that 1 to 3%. The future is uncertain when it comes to funding, and we have to. I believe it's prudent and recommendation of the Auditor General that we have between 1 and 3%, always in contingency. The next item here.
So, the current budget that we were in, did we not have to add over $1 million to balance the budget?
Sorry?
What did we have to add? So last year when we balanced the budget, how much more did we have to add to the budget when we amended it in, what is that, February?
About $100,000.
$100,000. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. It had gone up by more than $100,000, but you went into your surplus by $100,000 because your expenditures had exceeded the funding level by about $100,000.
So it was only $100,000.
Yeah.
Trustee Strachan.
I know it goes without saying, but you do still have the sale, we collectively, I guess, do have the sale of that land at some point to bring in, but I think you said that's a different funding envelope, right?
It's a different pot of money. We cannot use capital dollars to offset operating expenses.
Can you not get permission from the government to do that? In the
No, we
federal
cannot.
side, they can.
We could get fired if we do that.
Okay. They can do that. You have to go through the direct Ministry of Finance and everything.
We can move operating funding to capital,
But not the
but we
reverse.
can't do the reverse.
Okay.
In another area we could look at, do we go further on Bank of Canada interest rates? Will it hold in June? Every 0.25% change will change our interest revenue by about $50,000. So we're already expecting quite a drop. But if the board thinks that it will decline really slowly, we could look at additional interest revenues. And now I want to talk about the two special purpose funds. These are two that the ministry provides to the board that the board has some discretion over components of, and there's significant dollars here, so I just wanted to quickly do a review. So the first one is the Classroom Enhancement Fund for teachers. This is what we would call our restored collective agreement language that came in through a 2016 Supreme Court of Canada decision. So there was a memorandum of agreement reached between the British Columbia Teachers Federation and the province of BC that restored that language. And this is where when you hear the term remedy and you hear about our Classroom Enhancement Fund teachers, which is about 76 teachers this year that we have additional in the system, they comes from this funding. So they've given us $9.4 million as our preliminary estimate. And that only includes 2% of the salary framework, not the additional 1%. So that will come in the fall, but we will be budgeting, only be able to permitted to budget on the $9.4 million figure that they've given us. So it will go in at that, but it will revise when we actually know the number of teachers that we've hired and what their costs are. But there's a component of it that the board has some discretion over, and that is $979,114. And that includes overhead costs for sick leave replacements. So if you hire 76 new teachers and they're off, for instance, with illness, the cost for that comes out of here. It also covers their Pro-D, because teachers have a Pro-D fund, and we need to allocate a portion there. And we use it to support education assistance and human resources support. We also want to note that the Classroom Enhancement Fund is not part of the operating budget. It's a special purpose fund, and it's only intended to cover the incremental costs. So here is a multi-year proposal on that. It really just sees it as status quo, very much so, and adjusted for wage and inflation pressures. So there's a balanced budget of $979 on the overhead, with $979 in the expenditures.
Sorry to ask so many questions, but
That's okay.
when you see enrollment going down, with that, like I noticed the budget for this has gone up. Is that just because the salaries have gone up, or is it because you're talking about projection of students going down?
Yeah. The only students that are going down this year are in the categories of special needs. Overall, we think we're going to go up by about 71 students. That's not really factored in here. We have a fixed amount now year to year that gets inflation adjusted. So they are adjusting this one just for what they consider to be the wage component, the 2% increase. So it's very minimal, but it will continue to probably go up incrementally just based on our actual costs. We had an opportunity to do a submission, and then they locked us in once they approved what we were going to spend it on a number of years ago. The next one I want to talk about is the Community Link Fund. There is $512 that comes in to support the academic achievements and social functioning of vulnerable students. We use that for itinerant behavior intervention workers. Those are the workers that I'm going to try to find out where they're being charged, because I noted earlier that we have a surplus in this account, and I believe it's related very much to those workers. We have student support workers in there, and we also support our early years coordinator and clerical funding. A bit of a difference here for next year. Although the amount's going up from $739,000 to $761,000, you're going to have a little more staffing costs here. So the coordinator was also a principal, and that principal time was coming out of the operating budget, and next year that coordinator will be all a coordinator. So there's going to be a bit of an FTE rise there under the early learning side of this budget, as well as the services and supplies that are necessary for running that program. And there it is balanced off for you. Moving right along, there are other special purpose funds. The district will continue to receive funding that supports education assistance in doing collaboration. It's 1 hour a week in collaboration fund. We meet with the union, QP union, and we go over a plan for how that's going to be allocated, $363,000. To date, we've only seen the operating portion of our annual facilities grant. I'm sure the next time I see you, we'll have that funding here announced, but the $384,000 is in line with what we have this year. We would expect to see another $1.6 million on the capital side of that grant, yet to be announced for special purpose fund. So AFG does your building upkeep, painting, roofing, window replacements, etc. And here's, I think, where Trustee Thorne was going with his comments earlier about multi-year budgeting. He was just a few steps ahead. So it's really complex. We don't have a crystal ball about our future. We don't know what our funding rates will be, but we do know we have our estimates. We have an idea of how many students we think we're going to have. And that's based on the Beauregard data, and we've gone over that lots of times, and we've talked about all the declining birth rates, and we've talked about the decline, the lower in-migration levels. We talk about, staffing levels, so I have to make estimates based on that enrollment. Well, how many staff will we need to support those students? What are the projected salary increases? We haven't bargained yet, so we don't know what it will be after June 30th of this year. That bargaining process is about to start. For next year, we know what it is. We do know what it is after June 30th this year. June 30th, 2025, we don't have any idea what those rates are going to be. We don't know what the government's going to fund us on a per pupil rate or what the funding formula is even going to look like. We're taking a guess on inflation. We're taking a guess on future surplus deficit generation, which we're certainly hoping it's surplus. Any multi-year initiatives or one-time initiatives, these are complex. So when I give you a projection or a multi-year budget, it is the best I can do with the information that we have at the time. So I have to try to figure out what that per pupil rate change is going to be. I do that by estimating the wage increases, the benefit increases. I have to try to project the ministry's grant. I have to try to figure out how much surplus we're going to use. And through all that, what I have done is I've used 2% wage increase for 2025, 26, and 26, 27, and inflation stabilization to 2% in both of those years. Okay, so here's how it looks. We're starting with the revenues. It looks like last year. It looks just like last year. So if we look at 22-23, you can see where our operating revenues were, and that's an actual. If you look at 23-24, that's this year's budget, and a little bit further down, I'll bring in the surplus projection of that budget. If you look at 24-25, that's where we're starting. If we do everything that was on that first presentation, that big sheet I presented to you, I built it in. So what if we do all this and we move it forward? Then 25-26, that's my best guess based on what the per pupil rate could be. And you can see that I'm dropping investment income. And then we look at 26-27. I'm continuing to estimate an increase in the grant based on what I think it will be based on wages, and I'm dropping investment income further. Those wage columns are all based on those factors I gave you. How to move from 24-25 to 25-26 is basically 2%. I'm holding the benefit rates solid, steady, that they're going to remain at 25.92% of budget. And you get some totals. So we go to the bottom, and I'll start with 22-23. We ended the last year with $6.772 million, and I've showed you that figure a few times in this presentation and over the last couple of months. This year, if we make those two changes that I showed you in Note 3 and Note 4, we would be projecting a surplus of $1.59 million, not the $1.09 million that I showed you. And I've taken the restrictions that we've used this year. That would give us $4,713,000 at the end of this year. And then you would draw $2.5 million of that. And if I assumed that the surplus next year was going to be $750,000, at the end of next year you might expect to have $2.9 million or $3 million, which is hovering again in that 2% of, over 2%, high 2% of budget. Then 25-26, you would need to use $2.89 million to balance the budget. And you'd be down to $822,000. If you can kind of follow along here. 26-27, and this is assuming nothing changes. The ministry continues not to fund us for inflationary pressures. Well, inflation adds to the supply allocation, and that's where this pressure comes from. You would now be in the hole. So this is the same story. Again, we don't have a crystal ball that can take us out that far. We don't know what enrollments will look like. We don't necessarily know what funding will look like with any absolute certainty. But we definitely see that our purse strings are getting tighter and tighter, and that decisions need to be made around, sustainability. So we have another year, and then things get to be quite tight. Chair.
When I look at this, I think whoever runs for the board the next time will be the king that year. Is there something that we could be doing now? I guess the reason why I'm feeling a little more cautious about this budget than I thought I would, because I'm now saying this, is because when I came to the board, we had to make a pretty drastic multi-million-dollar cut. And when we did those cuts, we thought we kept it away from the classroom, but in the end, we didn't. We only harmed the classrooms because we didn't have the information that it's not that we should have had it, it's just through experience, I've now learned that those cuts were too deep in areas I thought were far away from the classroom. So is there something that we could be doing now that can, I know that you don't have a crystal ball, and I thank you so much for this, because it really makes me think about budget a little bit differently this year, but I'm wondering is if there's something that we can do now, or I don't know, to help cushion what's to come for the 2026-2027 projected year of a deficit of $1.655 million to start your budget, so with no surplus. So I guess what I'm wondering is are we running tight enough? Because I don't want to hear the stories that I'm hearing out of a Twilly school district, multi-years of multi-millions of dollars of cuts. I mean, every time I go away or I'm listening to board chairs, I'm hearing about cut. And the first thing they say is cut senior management. And the first thing I say is we did that and it blew up the district. So I tell boards, please don't do that, because we did it and I know what happened in the end result. And then the district had to slowly rebuild over the years because the cuts were too deep in areas we thought were far enough away from the classroom. So I guess I'm wondering is there a way for us to tighten up just a little bit more to be able to lessen the blow that's coming for the 2026-2027 budget? I would just hate to see us go, okay, well, you know, we could probably afford to do this one more year, and then stuff gets real. I'm just trying to figure out how we can gently do this so that we're not in the same predicament other boards are finding themselves in. Through the chair, sorry.
That's a really big question. I mean, what we would need to do is find additional reductions to reduce the reliance on surplus. Find some additional options, and I would need the senior team to do that review with me. But that would really be, instead of drawing $2 million and having 2% left in surplus, you'd be trying to preserve more of that for future years by making further reductions this year. So we have to come up with some additional options.
Is the superintendent still on the call, or am I going through Margaret?
Robin was on the call.
She's available. She's available. She's waiting.
Through the chair to the superintendent, are you there?
I am here.
Yeah, it sounds like that God voice, like, right? So, it's a hard question, I know. Can we tighten up a little bit more without affecting the well-being of our staff and our district and our kids? Like, is there areas that the team can look at possibly, or is this just a pipe dream and that the worst, like, that hard decisions are coming for 2026, 2027?
I think there's always things to look at in a creative fashion. And I think that if the board had interest in us looking at some other potential opportunities, we could certainly bring that back to the board.
Through the chair to the superintendent, just a follow-up, would they be large enough to make a difference, or are we just nickel and diming now?
That would be a good question. I think it would be more like thousands of dollars and $500, those nickels and dimes. I think you would be having to look at a variety of details in many areas.
Thank you.
Trustee Croft and then Trustee Thorne.
Well, I'd just like to make a comment that this assumes that we will be not compensated for any inflation. Mm-hmm. And that's as much guesswork as it is. Like, I'm I'm not sure we should assume that has any more credibility than assuming there will be some coverage for inflation. We don't know how the elections are going to turn out, but at the moment, the federal government is pouring money into BC in the millions of dollars, which will be realized in our child care budget. So I just, this is a prediction, and I'm not convinced that we need to react to it now, although having a plan in your back pocket is always a good thing. But I'm personally not quite ready to believe that there will be zero inflationary cost coverage.
Trustee Thorne.
I'm going right back to the trustee Croft made a point, but mine is simply inflation is going to be inflation. Bank rates are changing. And I'm just scared that if we have to start looking at this, and if we don't, we shouldn't be sitting in these chairs. We should be going home and letting somebody else try. I shouldn't say try, my mom would smack me in the head. She'd say, if you're gonna say try, then you're a liar. But we need to start focusing on what we can do. You know, they pay us big money to sit here. Sorry. We need to do something because we always believe students first.
Yeah.
And if we don't put students first, we have to start looking at withdrawing some of the programs. 10 to 1, everybody's going to go to the children who need us the most. It's not all about the academic students, it's about all students, and we have to look at that first and foremost. And I'm hoping that we can do some things and start figuring out how we approach. You know, next week we're in Vancouver. Perfect time to start sitting down and talking with other districts to find out how can we as a conglomerate, not as a separate district, but all districts, start focusing on one direction.
I have a comment about a lot of things. This district, we do budget conservatively. Hence, at times we overshoot our budget surplus. Because we have done that, even in this budget, it is a very conservative budget. The 1 to 3% requirement for budget surplus, we're always on the high side of that. Yes, there's trouble brewing in our economy. Our government seem to want to spend a lot of money, but sooner or later that's going to come to a stop. So we have to be, yes, we definitely have to be very careful, and we have to keep it on the radar that cuts may be coming in a couple years. And as long as we stay with kind of on the high side of that 1 to 3% surplus, do we want to be nickel and diming the district? Which, no, we don't. This is not the time to be nickel and diming, because how much staff time are we going to put into nickel and diming? Is it going to pay off?
Exactly.
You know, is there a big ticket item out there that we can do without? Probably not. 90% of our budget goes to wages. So we don't have a lot to play with to begin with. And as long as we budget conservatively and stay kind of target that 2 to 3% surplus, if things are going to hit us in 2 years, then we'll know better next year what's coming. And staff should be keeping that in their back of their mind and just watching it so they can inform us of, are we going to need to be making cuts? And so do we want to be nickel and diming? No, we don't. That's a waste of time. That's probably something that, you know, we should be looking at our fish. But to go ask staff can you save $1,000 here or $10,000 there, probably not going to do us any good. Trustee Schmidt.
To be clear, Chair, I didn't ask, that's why I asked, was it nickel and diming or was it big ticket items? I did not say to do that, so just to be clear. Also, I'm wondering, through the chair to the Secretary Treasurer, the board signed on to a joint letter that I shared with you regarding inflation and so on and so forth. Your colleague from Saanich, has he mentioned whether they've gotten any feedback on that letter?
I haven't spoken to him recently, so I don't know. I know it usually takes some time for the ministry to respond through their channels. So I think based on the timing of when that letter went out, they likely haven't heard back yet. But the point of that letter being that when you're a slowly growing school district that is medium sized, your funding doesn't really keep up with inflation. If you're booming like Surrey, you're not scaling up at the rate for which you're receiving funding. So that was the point that letter was making, that we kind of sit in this. And if you're also extremely small and you're declining in population, you're in funding protection, you're funding is secured year over year. So we're in the wrong growth spot to deal with inflationary pressures, and our funding formula is predominantly per pupil based, and it does not address districts our size who are in slow growth, which there are many of them around the province: Penticton, Vernon, Saanich. I would even suggest that Courtenay Comox and Campbell River aren't growing at a great pace. So the next steps, if I can move on. The board will be considering all of their priorities of the strategic plan when discussing options to balance the budget. And the next time we come back, we'll be trying to align any options that we have, new or the ones that we have here, to the strategic priorities. And I'll try to think of a way to do that with the new priorities that you also mentioned earlier on, Trustee Smith. And then that feedback will be reviewed and options explored at the April 23rd meeting. And then we're hoping to turn that around pretty quickly, April 25th. We are holding another meeting in May. I think that was May the 2nd, just in case. But if we can move along, we would have a recommendation of a budget on April 25th. That's usually pretty solid. The board would adopt that budget May 7th. Staffing processes will probably informally start before May 7th. I put here May 8th. I don't think Margaret would want that to be May 8th, because if the board's already approved, the committee's approved to the board that the budget is balanced, she's probably going to go on that date and start to do her work, because staffing is so complex and takes so long. So we're at the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for all of the questions and queries. I think there's some more.
Actually, for me, this wasn't a question. Thank you for the thoughtful process that you put us through, and the thoughtfulness of the notes. That really, really helps. And I know that some of us will go and wrestle with our souls a little bit later, and that's just normal for budget. But I just wanted to thank you for the process and for the first draft. I think that the first draft, though there's a couple of hard pills in there to swallow, looks good. And I just wanted to thank you, the staff, and the senior management team for education. Just thank you to all of the finances and everybody for putting this together and presenting it so thoroughly to the board. So,
Trustee Croft.
A comment and a question. So one, I didn't mean any criticism in saying that we should be looking at, inflation not being covered. It was just another option. So I totally agree. When you're presenting this kind of scenario, you want to go conservative. So I appreciate that, and echo everything that Trustee Schmidt said. She sort of took the words right out of my mouth. This is one of the best processes I've been through in these few years, so this has been really, really great. My question is, we have heard for a number of times from our partner groups about the violence in schools, and there isn't a line item for that. But were the board to think that we wanted to put some resources towards that particular issue, where would we put it, and what good would it do? That, I don't know if you have an answer right this minute.
I think that's going to be a takeaway,
Okay.
and to bring back at the next meeting.
And I would assume for anything you add on, you have to find somewhere else to cut in order to maintain that, right? So we did talk a little bit, you went through these, and some of these are really critical for us as a team, but you didn't really amalgamate these in, so there's still some room here, correct?
The only one I addressed there was really around the website contract. The others are all intact.
Are they?
And I did take 50,000 in the first draft from the additional inclusive ed supports that was added last year. So those two are two that I have here as suggestions.
Okay.
So of the $1 million, I'm suggesting rolling back 80 of that.
Okay.
Thank you for saying that through the chair of the Secretary Treasurer, because Assistant Superintendent Rowan said that he had about $30,000 to $40,000 left. Could we not just roll over what he has left? So it doesn't look like we're doing a $50,000 cut, but actually we're just rolling over what he remains. So really it's like a $20,000 cut instead?
The board sets their restrictions on the financial statements when you adopt the statements. So if that is a request of the board, any unspent money could be part of that surplus that rolls into that category.
Okay.
So when I'm doing my projections,
Yeah.
I am fully assuming that those those funds are spent at this point. So that money has not been accounted for.
It's not.
It's not accounted for in my surplus projection.
It's not accounted for.
No, which would mean it would be available for rollover without affecting the surplus.
So instead of having a $50,000 cut, really it's, if we cut it, we've got surplus he's got surplus to roll over.
It could be part of a year-end restriction, and then Claudia would be building that into the financial
And he
statements.
says 30 to 40, right? Thousand?
He did.
So if we leave it at 35, we've got 15 grand there. Yay.
Thorne?
This is great, Jason. I want to thank you and everybody that put this together. I mean, it's hard. To me, it's hard. And I think that I understand, but at the same time, I can't help but feel frustrated that eventually we're going to end up on one knee because we didn't foresee, we foresee things, but we have to better prepare for it. You know, I voted with everybody at one of the board meetings, and if I don't seem happy, it's because I've been overridden with guilt because I didn't want to vote the way I did. And you know, I want to talk about that with the board one night because I think we may have made, I did. I looked at something else and wasn't looking at what everybody else was looking at. And I've been regretful ever since that I did raise my hand when I wanted to say no.
On a funding issue or on a policy issue?
On an issue that we.
Is it a funding issue from budget?
No.
Okay.
No.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much, Mr. Sandquist. This is hard budgeting for a school district, especially with the amount of unknowns that I mean, we're still waiting on this pot or that pot. And I mean, trying to project what's going to happen next year based on the information that you have now that could change any minute. You're just kind of going by the big picture of a lot of what everybody else is saying. So thank you very much for your hard work and all your support. And we look forward to the next few meetings and sorting this out.
Thank you.
Can I get a motion? Is there any other business? Motion to adjourn. Trustee Croft, Trustee Schmidt, all in favor? Thank you very much. We will see everybody next week.